Greg Party, and I've got the pleasure of moderating the panel today. I'd like to introduce our participants. To my extreme right is Ed Kelly. He is Managing Director and Leader with IHS. Ed oversees the company's America's Gas and Power Consulting practice. He's got over 25 years of experience in the natural gas business and was formerly the founder of Wood Mackenzie's North American Gas and North American Research practice. To his left is John Morrison. So John is Director, Institutional Equity Research with CIBC World Markets. John is responsible for leading the firm's coverage of Canadian oilfield services sector. John also plays a very major role in terms of CIBC's macro commodity research. To his left is Tim Watson. Tim is the head of Canadian Energy Investment Banking with Bank of America Merrill Lynch. So Tim looks as though he has certainly been up to his ears in terms of LNG transactions here over the last few years. He did serve as the advisor to Petronas in connection with the joint venture back in 2011, as well as the $6 billion acquisition of Progress in 2012. And the firm is advising Pacific Northwest in terms of partners and so forth with the as the venture moves ahead. So we'll be interested to hear from Tim on perspective with deals. And then to my right, last but not least, is Tetsuro Komuro, who is the president and CEO of Mitsui & Co. Canada. Tetsuro has been with Mitsui since 1978. You certainly don't look old. I look a lot older than you do. He was also the officer of the company's motor vehicles business unit and has served in a variety of roles with Mitsui. So just in terms of the structure today, we're going to start with we'll start with Ed, and we're going to work our way across in terms of opening remarks for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to the discussion. So with that, Ed.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Greg, and thank you, other panelists. I'm pleased to be here from Houston at the BC LNG conference, and I want to thank Greg again for having the courtesy to source IHS on 4 of 5 of your slides from this morning.
Indeed.
So I appreciate that, and my only request would be that you double the font size on that sourcing early, if you could, to let everyone know that IHS does a great deal of research and consulting in terms of global, really, natural gas and electric power markets, as well as really all hydrocarbon forms worldwide. And I'm pleased to represent IHS here. My experience happens to have been largely in the natural gas side of the business. Just a couple of points made that I think want to reinforce and sort of put some numbers around some of the dynamics that we've heard about this morning, because there's been a lot of discussion about competitiveness already today in the course of the day. So I just want to put a few numbers around it as we see it. The range of uncertainty around liquefaction project costs is substantial, and any uncertainty going toward the upper end could mean the difference between profitability and not in an individual project. And so all of these sponsors will be taking significant degrees of risk. That range of uncertainty, as we put it, as third-party observers, is 9 to 1250 for Canadian projects and about 950 to 13 for US-based projects, depending on the individual project dynamics and whether you're brownfield or greenfield or what have you. And that's delivered into Asia, so 9 to 1250 from Canada, and 950 to 13, roughly speaking, from the US Gulf Coast delivered into Asia. We have those components broken down also for you, if you care to ask that question later on. Another major point I'd like to make, the scale of the proposals is really unprecedented, first of all, and unrealistic. Just a little bit of math around that. It's highly unrealistic. Total demand, I believe one presenter referenced that number earlier today in terms of billions of cubic feet per day. I'll use MMTPA in an international audience. 239 were traded, MMTPA were traded in 2013. Proposed worldwide currently if current demand is 239 MMTPA, proposals worldwide, in addition to that which is under construction currently, 682 MMTPA. So when we say that there are competitors to Canada and to the US for that matter, it's really an extreme number of projects competing for even 40% demand growth over the next 5 to 10 year period. The amount under construction, in addition to 682 MMTPA on top of the 239 existing market in 2013, the amount actually under construction, 113.5 MMTPA. So 50% growth almost is baked in to the supply complex over the next 5 years. So it's that competitiveness that the CEO of Petronas alluded to earlier that is relatively extreme and what makes the overall project set from our observational and analytic point of view unprecedented and unrealistic. That's the way North America behaves though. The cost of proposals is relatively limited. The cost of action then gets very serious. So a lot of these proposals we think will simply be left by the wayside. As we look at the numbers, I showed you a bit overlapping competitive range between Western Canada and the US. As we look at projects individually and collectively in Canada and the US, there are really an offsetting and balancing system of advantages and disadvantages and challenges and opportunities in the two jurisdictions. We analyze projects on the basis of a lot of different factors. And as I was doing my own sort of scoring yesterday and this morning of the project factors and how we observe them, and on a macro level, sort of if 1 to 5 is good, 5 being good, 1 being not so good, the USA came out on average 2.5, depending on whether your project is brownfield or greenfield. Your project would be better or worse in that scale. Canada came out at around 2.0 on the same scale, so a very close sort of weighing 8 separate factors. Major Canadian advantages are politics and geopolitics in Canada versus the US, and I thought it was instructive, having analyzed the business for a while, that early on the buyer set considered Canada a more stable geopolitical circumstance and context than the US. Simple feed gas availability, probably advantage to the US on that front. The US offers a simple deal from an LNG buyer's perspective. You get a tolling agreement, limited capital exposure, and Henry Hub price exposure. So in terms of supply diversity, not necessarily national diversity, but in terms of supply diversity, it gets you your Henry Hub exposure in a very clear way. And a very simple way with a tolling deal. Now you've got to arrange your own supplies upstream of that, and there will be strategic decisions, and different off-takers will make different decisions in terms of how far upstream they go and in what manner they go upstream, but that's just part of dealing in the fairly complex US and Canadian traded natural gas marketplace. In terms of domestic gas needs, I think that's a draw. I think both the US and Canada have a great deal of resource base above and beyond their own domestic gas needs. In terms of environmental regulation and predictability of those, probably advantage Canada on that. A lot of value judgments in that, but being a US citizen from Houston, I would give advantage in the bureaucratic structure and the practice and execution of the bureaucratic structure to Canada on that front. The market context, a slight advantage to the US, probably. Just simply, that's the simplicity of that deal, the simplicity of the Henry Hub price exposure, and the ability to mechanically access that Henry Hub price exposure from the intake of your LNG facility is a simple and executable deal from an off-taker's perspective. Actual ability to execute the project. If it's a new project starting out brand new today, I would give that a small advantage to the Canadian sector on that. A lot of value judgments in these. You can shoot me or stone me later as a result of this. Economics. For greenfield, small advantage to the US brownfield projects, really. I mean, brownfield is, the capital exposure is more limited, and again, the simplicity of that Henry Hub price exposure. So, But it isn't a dual competitive environment either. There is the rest of the world to contend with. I mean, of that 682 million tons on top of that 239 million ton 2013 marketplace, about 25% are outside of the US and Canada. Australia brownfield is a significant competitor that I don't think there's been a lot of remarked on today so far. But Australian brownfield projects, once you've, is it good money after bad or not, the off-takers will have to decide. But Australian brownfield projects, in fact, into East Asia are very competitive as we look at those numbers. East African greenfield projects, Alaska, Russia, all other, those total approximately 400 million tons in this total space, of which 682 is proposed, 113 is under construction. So it's just a huge, overwhelming really, set of project proposals that exist in the worldwide LNG marketplace that are competing for those buyers. And I think the buyers that we've heard from today made that very clear, that there is competition and a strongly competitive dynamic. Major competitors into the Asian marketplace, we put Middle Eastern brownfield in that competitive space into the Asian marketplace as well. So expansions of existing projects as they exist in the Middle East. We obviously put Australian brownfield and other Pacific brownfield expansions in the competitive mix into that market. Australian brownfield, as I mentioned, and West African greenfield. So it's really a very large project set in addition to the US and Canada that have to be considered in terms of all-in economic circumstances. That said, from our base case perspective, an LNG business does develop here, does begin to develop here in a real concrete sense by 2020 and begins to develop, and that acceleration occurs in terms of completions between the years 2020 and 2025. With the larger uncertainties, two were remarked on, we agree with those. The Japanese nuclear policy is a large fulcrum of uncertainty in terms of the overall competitive and contestable market between 2020 and 2025 and beyond. And the Chinese circumstance. Yes, there's an announced pipeline deal between Russia and China, but the Chinese energy demands are such that it could overwhelm that pipeline. Sounds like a big deal, is in a sense, but 38 BCM, my US-based math, 3.8 billion cubic feet per day, for those of you doing simplistic conversions, with a coal plant completed every week in China for a several-year period, really displacing only a percentage of that coal would overwhelm the energy ability of that pipeline to deliver and would require a great deal of additional LNG demand if China chooses to do so. So the Chinese energy policy choices just mathematically could create a huge demand sink in the worldwide LNG marketplace in which the room for Canada to compete would expand accordingly in the 2020s especially. So we do think in a base case circumstance that an LNG business does get up and going in Canada in the face of all of this competition and does begin to expand beyond 2020. Thank you.
John.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for the BC government putting on the conference. Rarely do you actually see a government pull together such a collective group of stakeholders ahead of the actual development, so kudos to them for bringing it to the forefront. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through my introduction because I think it's probably a little bit more valuable to actually sit in the Q&A and talk through what are some of the most pertinent issues out there. But I think one of the pleasures that we get out of what I do for a living, which is cover the oilfield services sector, is that you get to see Canadian companies that obviously are very strong in Canada, but also have footprints around the world and are a strong service provider in areas like Latin America, Australia, and all around the world. And by covering that sector, you get exposure to the various different challenges that you have in different geographies. And I think as you tour the world and you see these different countries, you realize that Canada does still have some very concrete advantages relative to other markets. So as much as we monitor the competition that's out there, that's there in Russia, that's going to be coming on in East Africa, and obviously the US is a meaningful competitor, I think it's important to also recognize that Canada does have a lot of advantages working for us. We've been an energy exporting market for over 5 decades. We're one of the most stable producers into the US market for a long history of time. You look at the fiscal regime that we've had in Canada, although there's been little pockets of instability around the royalty review that happened a few years ago, at the forefront, I think that we're a fairly politically stable nation. So realistically, we think that Canada does probably have, from a firm perspective, the likelihood of delivering kind of 2 to 4 facilities over the next decade into the global marketplace, but ultimately we need to get a lot of things right to actually be able to move forward. So one, setting the fiscal framework out of the BC government, hopefully sooner than later, is kind of the first step, and then signing offtake agreements that allows companies to kind of move forward from there. So I think that, from our perspective, Canada certainly has a lot of competition that's out there, the U.S. at the forefront, but some of the stumbling blocks that have happened in Australia have created opportunities for the Canadian market. And as much as Canada is very similar to Australia in that we've got a small population, a very large land mass, high standard of living, and can face massive cost escalation, I think the advantage that Canada has on its side is that we've had a Canadian energy industry that goes through cycles all the time. Over the past 50 years, there's been 19 industry pullbacks in terms of year-over-year declines in capital spending, and the Canadian energy industry is fairly resilient to scaling the business and ensuring profitability. So as we go through an upcycle, as much as I think that we have to try to mitigate some of the cost inflation challenges ahead of us, we're different than Australia in that we've had a history of energy development for more than 100 years out there, and I think it sets us up fairly well to compete in the global or the Canadian LNG possible boom that's on the horizon over the coming kind of 5 to 10 years that we see. So that's pretty much all I had for opening remarks, so I'll pass it to Tim.
John, thanks for that. Tim?
Sure. So as Greg said, our firm, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, I might use the short form BAML, just to keep it simple. We've done a lot of work with Petronas in the past 3 or 4 years. We've helped bring them into Canada originally back in 2011 with their original joint venture on the upstream side. We helped them consolidate that upstream position, and then subsequent to that, really over the 2013, 2014 time period, we've helped them in terms of this partnering exercise. So a lot of my comments today, I'll try and make them a little bit different here, and I'll try and relate my experience on those files and translate that into what we've learned here. I'd say in terms of the Petronas partnering process, which really got underway about 15 months ago or so, we saw very strong interest right from the very start. Quite a few parties came to us unsolicited with interest in the project. And so why was that? I mean, clearly from a Canadian perspective, I think we've heard a lot of commentary today in terms of what Canada actually does bring to the table. I don't need to go through that with you again, but let's not sell ourselves short. I mean, there are some clear benefits for Canada. The fact that we're a major exporter of natural gas today and have been for decades really is a distinguishing feature from some of the other jurisdictions when they were starting out on the LNG front. I would say 2 other key factors. Just let's not sell short the diversification point. I'll come back to that in some of my future comments here, but that's exceptionally important in terms of how the partners, at least the ones that Petronas has garnered here, we're thinking about things. And just the government support, I think, at various levels shouldn't be undersold either. The project itself, when we launched this in 2013, there was a lot of uncertainty. I mean, if you think about it, what we did have was a massive upstream position. Progress, the formerly the independent public company, which was acquired for $6 billion, had probably the single largest concentrated position in the northwest portion of the Montney Fairway. I won't get into what we thought the resource was, but it was staggering. So we had that for sure. We didn't have a pipeline, although we had a development agreement in place early in 2013, and we were able to talk about that and the plans associated with it. Obviously, there's no LNG plant yet, but there was enough definition with a pre-feed in December 2012 ahead of the partnering process, and then they went to feed around May 2013. And so that's still unfolding. And obviously, we brought in 4 partners, actually 5 partners, without any real tangible definition yet on what those liquefaction costs are. To Greg's point earlier, it's a major uncertainty still, but that didn't stop us from actually, attracting that partner interest. Shipping, Petronas is has one of the biggest LNG fleets in the world, speaks for itself. LNG offtake. Petronas has a proven ability to access the global LNG market. It has many well-established Asian partnerships, which it's able to bring to the table. It's got operating strength. And just from a timing perspective, I think people even a year ago got the sense that Petronas was committed to moving that project forward to an FID decision in a fairly quick way. So obviously, the success of the partnering process, speaks for itself. Our view as a firm is that, realistically, we think probably 2 to 3 LNG projects, and I'm talking the large-scale onshore projects. I think there's room for a couple of the floating, the much smaller scale floating projects as well. In terms of market structure, I think it's interesting. I mean, our view is that Canada is very much following the Australian market structure, and that means that all, like if you look at Australia, both the west coast and the east coast of Australia, all projects were fully integrated in nature. So that means everybody was investing all the way along the value chain. There's no exceptions. I mean, every single project was like that. Similarly, in Australia, virtually all the project partners tended to be upstream strategic entities. Some were national oil companies, some were majors, some were BG and companies like that. There were not very many end users that were actually owners of the Australian projects. And I think Canada essentially is going to follow the same path. Clearly, that's what we're doing with Petronas and their project. That's what's happened with Shell. That's probably what's going to happen with Chevron, if you want to pick the top 3. The U.S. is a totally different structure, and there's reasons for it, which we've already heard. But none of those projects are integrated, and they won't be. Moreover, again, there's very few actual off-takers that actually have ownership in those projects. What you have are LNG aggregators like the Japanese trading houses, including Mitsui, Sumitomo, BP, Total, GDF, but very few end users in those projects. So I think it's interesting just structurally as you look at how those two situations unfolded and what we're seeing so far from a Canadian perspective. Just quickly here, and then I'll stop. Our firm actually takes physical positions in the global LNG market. We rent ships. We trade LNG on our trading side, and our research puts out global views in terms of where we think the market's going. When we talk to the Asian community and other buyers internationally, the consensus view to us seems to be that there will be a continued positive outlook for LNG well beyond 2020. The key trends are growing gas demand in emerging markets. That would include places that you wouldn't have thought about, like Egypt, Turkey, Argentina, for example. Greater reliance on LNG imports is a key driver. China is the key growth market. We know that, but Brazil is a growth market. Kuwait's a growth market, believe it or not. And then, historically, some of those traditional exporters like Algeria and Indonesia are going to become more reliant on intakes. So, those are key drivers. Our firm's view is that we see demand rising from 250 million tons per annum in 2013 to about 450 million tons by 2025. So that's about a 5% compound annual growth rate. That exceeds the expected growth rate in a global gas market, which is only about 3%. But keep in mind, the LNG piece of the global gas market is only just a sliver. It's just a small portion of the global gas market. So LNG is going to become a bigger part of that market over time through its higher growth rate. Another comment I'll make here is our firm thinks that over the duration of 2014, as many as potentially 10 Japanese nuclear reactors are going to restart. And we think there's a potential for another 10 in 2015, 2016. So that's a significant driver here. Having said that, we think that another 30 of those reactors are not going to come back. And so roughly speaking, you're going to get probably 10,000 megawatts of demand from those reactors when they come on, but not the 40,000 that you had back in 2010. So that's an important driver as well. In terms of supply, I think it's important that we see this demand that I just talked about, because the fact is the expectation is supply is going to grow roughly 8% a year through 2020 on a global basis. And that's after no supply additions in 2013 and 2014. Our view as a firm is that the U.S. is going to take probably 13-14% global market share in LNG by 2020 from virtually nothing right now. So that's quite significant. We'd also caution, however, that the history of liquefaction plants is one of missed deadlines, cost overruns, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. There's a fairly high probability we're going to see delays here in this massive stack of supply that we talk about. And my last comment here is, although the U.S. has the potential to be very disruptive in a global LNG market, it's not going to happen at the earliest till 2017, 2018 in any sort of size. And the other thing that's important is, from a pricing standpoint, it doesn't take a whole lot to move the U.S. offside. I mean, if you're thinking $4 to $4.50 Henry Hub, that means that they can land their gas at probably, $10, $11, $12 per MBTU. If Henry Hub, goes to, let's say, $6, essentially that's going to put U.S. supply costs very much on par with what Australia's doing, $13, maybe even $14. So, that's a dollar shift in Henry Hub. And, for anybody who's, hasn't studied, North American gas prices over the past 20 years, it's one of the most volatile commodities on record. And so just keep that in mind as well.
Tim, thank you. Last but not least, Tsui, you're going to make some comments to some slides.
Let me go to the podium. That's much easier for me. Thank you. And I'd like to walk through some slides in order to discuss the global competitiveness of Canadian LNG based on Mitsui's global LNG business through an investment and also trading LNG from the Japanese LNG players' perspective. This slide shows Japan's power mix. As you can see here, the nuclear and coal-powered electricity played the base load previously. However, due to current shutdown of all nuclear power plants in Japan, LNG demand has increased significantly. Currently, about 50% of the power supplied is LNG fired, and total LNG consumption has increased by 20 million tons to a total 90 million tons per year. This shows different pricing for each market. As you see here, Japan's LNG import price has been linked to the global crude oil price. The price gap between Japanese LNG import price and the U.S. natural gas price has been increased due to shale gas revolution in U.S. since 2008. The current Japanese economy, due to the loss of the nuclear energy and increased fuel procurement costs, including LNG, the Japanese national trade deficit situation is getting worse. And Japan got a record deficit of trade as $115 billion last year. The priority in Japan's national policy on the energy is to reduce fuel procurement cost. Supply demand in Japan. The Mitsui's estimation is that Japan's total LNG may gradually increase to 95 million tons by 2030. Increased demand will be covered by the currently existing LNG projects and extending the long-term contracts. Key issue is how to secure stable LNG supply to Japanese market, especially post-2020. The worldwide supply-demand outlook. The current demand is 240 million tons per year, and Japan's share is between 30 and 40%. And this is expected to increase to 530 million tons per year by 2030. Demand increase from Asia will be the main reason. With many existing LNG projects to be started, total supply may surpass total demand in midterm, which means that competitive pricing and market situation will be seen. The long-term LNG and natural gas trade flow. The LNG demand of 2030 in Asia-Pacific region will increase from 170 million tons to 380 million tons per year due to strong demand in China, India, Southeast Asia, and Japan. LNG supply from Africa will increase from 40 million tons to 120 million tons per year, and Australia will increase from 20 million tons to 130 million tons per year. And in addition, North America may export 200 million tons per year by 2030. This is Canadian LNG. The global LNG industry has potential to grow, but the competitiveness will be tightened. The Japan's expectation on Canadian LNG covers 3 points in our view. The first, as Japanese customers' priority is to reduce the fuel procurement cost, more competitive price may be required. The second, it is important for suppliers to respond to customers' requirement with flexibility in LNG price formula. As an example, in US, Sabine Pass and Corpus Christi contracted recently with Henry Hub pricing formula for long-term supply. The third, while Asia-Pacific region and Middle East countries were previously major LNG suppliers to Japan, in order to seek diversification of supply sources and require long-term stable supply, Japanese buyers are studying Canadian LNG projects seriously. In our view, Canadian LNG has an advantage like abundant resources for the great export capacity, strong support from the federal and the provincial government to LNG industries, and shorter freight distance compared to Gulf of Mexico, not involving Panama Canal issue. On the other hand, timely completion of LNG long-term pipelines must be expected. In long-term LNG market, how to secure a stable customer with a competitive price will be a key issue for Canadian LNG suppliers. Lastly, this shows Mitsui's business in the global market LNG industry. Mitsui conducts business in a variety of gas value chain, including upstream LNG production, project investment, and mid and downstream LNG vessels, receiving terminals, distribution, and processing. In Canada, we are looking forward to participating in LNG projects, including long-term offtake opportunity to contribute to Canadian LNG industry and Canada-Japan's win-win relationship in energy strategy. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We're going to turn maybe just to some questions, and I think in all of the opening remarks, you've all touched, I think, on very, very interesting aspects of what the chain looks like in terms of LNG. So as opposed to asking the question, what are the key advantages for Canadian LNG, I think Ed he migrated into this a little bit. Where does British Columbia win today, and what would be the the empty boxes that would need to be checked in terms of ensuring global competitiveness right now? And maybe what we can do is we can think about this in terms of upstream, midstream, and ultimately the downstream. I just want to change a little bit here, so John, why don't we start with you? Oil field services, Petronas is talking about 25, 30 rigs. Montney gas production is what, 2.5, maybe thereabouts in terms of production. The resources there, have we got the ammunition in terms of actually getting to feed these projects, and what happens? What's that scenario if we get more than one project approved here over the next year or two?
Yeah, it's interesting, and the comment was made earlier in a different panel where they said, BC's had a 50-year history in natural gas, and it's taken 50 years to get to 3.5 BCF a day. So how does it actually contemplate getting meaningfully above that in 2 or 3 projects capturing 3.5 Bs? I think the challenges that we have, first, I guess I'll back up. The first thing that I think that the industry ultimately needs is clarity on the fiscal side for accelerated offtakes to move forward for us to actually reach FID. And obviously, we've gotten some early signs of what the fiscal framework is going to look like. Back in February, when the BC government came out with their proposed tax structure, but there's a lot of movement within that tax structure. So as much as we can get color and clarity on what that thing finally looks like and what all of the inherent costs that we don't know at this point come to fruition, then I think FIDs can be reached. I think that offtakes can be reached. In terms of the actual oil field services market, can we deliver the capacity in terms of people to deliver 5, 6, 7 BCF of growth out of BC? I think we certainly can. The difference is we need to get clarity on timelines of when you need to reach that, and ultimately the capital investments that need to be made for a surety of supply. So the largest challenge in the oil field services market in Canada is the constant volatility. And the staffing and labor issues are pervasive, but they're pervasive because every 3 years in Canada we go through a cyclical downturn where everybody has to lay everybody off and come back to the table and rehire. And what you'll find is that when you go through a down cycle, 75% of the people that have been laid off in the first 3 years of the industry never come back in. So you're constantly segregating your labor pool. In terms of the actual delivery of equipment, that's not an issue. We've got more than enough capacity to bring on 25, 75 rigs in a year should we actually need to. Same on the pressure pumping side and various other equipment side. Labor has always been the pinch point in Canada, and ultimately I don't think that we have a challenge meeting those labor requirements if we have clarity that ultimately Petronas is going to go forward, reach FID, export gas in kind of 2018. As long as they're willing to sign 3, 4, 5-year contracts, I think that we can certainly deliver it from the oil field services side to reach those needs. And I think contrasting BC relative to, say, Australia, the difference is that it was a very early energy market. It didn't have the vertical integration in terms of being able to bring on additional equipment should it be needed. The majority of it was manufactured in North America. So it just didn't have the flexibility to accelerate should they fall behind schedule. And I think that Canada has a long history of being able to scale up the business when needed.
So we're talking BC gas right now, but Alberta is going to play a role here. Would that be your expectation in terms of supplying that gas?
I think at the end of the day, some of the supply is going to come from Alberta. It's naive to think that 100% of supply is solely going to come from BC, and ultimately that's going to go to Asia. I think that between the two markets, we always say about, this is a BC opportunity, and I think that we have to step back and say it's really a Canadian opportunity, and for this to be successful, we ultimately have to have kind of a Canadian solution. There has to be partnership amongst all of the energy markets in Western Canada and conversations across provinces to ensure that we can actually not have rapid cost overruns and cost inflations. And ultimately, if BC does get the go-ahead, we set a fiscal framework that makes sense, and ultimately FIDs get reached, that the economics of them don't get blown out of the water because we bring on too many oil sands projects at the same time. So there's ultimately, I think, a limit to the amount of development that can go on in Canada, and to prevent having similar issues as other geographies, you need to have as much a collective solution amongst provinces as possible.
Ed, does the upstream get a tick in your box right now, Canada-wise?
Actually, it does. I mean, the resource base is substantial enough and competitive enough, especially as we look at the liquids credits and potential liquids credits associated with the upstream activity. And the more we look at the costs, really, the more, the Montney especially looks like a pretty darn good resource base that can affect an increase. I mean, if you look at a monthly production pattern, it looks more similar to the Marcellus than to other, slower developing kinds of shales. All shales are not equal, all tight formations are not equal, but it looks to be on the good side so far. And, if recent history is part of the evidence, then the evidence is to the positive for that. Now, all others, it's in relatively early stages of cost development, and they tend to be heterogeneous and early producer experience, so there's a little more uncertainty in some of the other plays, Cordova embayment, Duvernay even, Horn River, the real cost structure of that, bringing that to bear. another small point I'd make is that if there is exposure to the Western Canadian marketplace for some of these projects, if they are taking from the pool supplies, if you will, and they aren't completely drill to fill, then our work would indicate that there is a pricing response that occurs to that. So if they aren't segregated and purely dedicated supplies and they are pulling from the Alberta pool, the AECO price does respond to that, and the Sumas price does respond. So volatility works sort of throughout North America in response to these LNG export patterns potentially. So it's not simple in that regard.
So I think we're going to give the upstream a check mark. So the resource we're in good shape from a resource standpoint. All right, so Tim, you've been in the minds of lots of LNG companies and so on, how they're thinking about this. The regulatory, obviously finalization of the fiscal structure. I think we heard Premier Clark today say, I thought I heard November 30th. I thought I heard dates like that and so forth, but it certainly looks as though we'll have some completion this year. How much of an issue is the regulatory rate now, not just necessarily what BC is doing with the tax, but other, whether it's environmental, how much of that is on the minds of the folks you're talking to these days making FIDs?
Well, it's obviously, it's a factor. And if it's the tax issue, then obviously that's going to go to economics to some degree, or you have to factor that into your economics. It's funny though, I mean, again, as I think about how we marketed the Petronas opportunity over a year ago, I would say that there was, believe it or not, less of a focus on sort of landed supply costs. So we're talking about a lot of numbers here. We're talking about Australia lands at $13 per MMBTU versus $10 in the U.S. versus Canada somewhere in the middle. But I think the reality is that all these projects are pre-FID. Some of them are pre-FEED. Most of them are pre-FEED, and there's so much uncertainty that, and I think that coupled with the fact that, frankly, a number of these partners have been burned by, whether it's consultant estimates or industry estimates in other situations, and I'm thinking really Australia here, that believe it or not was not front and center in the process we undertook with the partners that came into the Petronas project at the end of the day. It's costs are important, liquefaction costs, tax, other regulatory impacts are going to be important here once they make a decision on their final investment. But these guys have all signed up for this project and are going to spend money between now and the end of the year to scope that out. And as we heard from the keynote address from the CEO of Petronas today, there's clearly an expectation that they will have clarity on that particular point by Q4 of this year.
So I think we could probably give a check on the fiscal and just to emphasize, right, the tax structure that was at least floated back in February, I think was 1.5% on first phase until payout, and then it was up to 7%. I think there was an emphasis on the up to 7%. So it certainly sounded as though there was some wiggle room in what that number looks like. Tetsuo, from your perspective, and I'll go back, I'll tell you a little story. I was in Tokyo back in November and did a series of meetings and talking nothing but LNG. And I remember one gentleman pointing towards the map and saying, this is your resource, and by the way, it's commercially stranded. And to us, that means less expensive, not more expensive. And we're just not sure you're going to be less expensive. But from your perspective, from the Asian perspective right now, if there's one or two things that you could change, we're going to come to liquefaction in a minute, but if there's one or two things that you could say, okay, we have clarity around this and this, what would accelerate the process in your view?
We talk about the competitiveness, right?
Yeah.
And the BC has obviously a key advantage, like I addressed a little bit in the comments that there's significant gas reserve for the export capacity, and also strong support from the government for the long-term commitment, and also they close to the large market like in Asia. So those are obviously the advantage. But on the other hand, the cost-wise, we, in our view, this on the competitiveness for the upstream feed gas production cost, we have a significant impact in the Canadian LNG project. Though, of course, there are some pipeline transportation costs as well as the liquefaction cost associated. Because of the Canadian unconventional shale gas exploration, there's gas production cost associated and how to reduce drilling and drilling cost per well, and how to achieve higher productivity. That's very important in our view. So this is the most expected area in terms of the pricing formula to be determined for the future, the actual purchase or sales, the marketing on that.
So that's helpful. We're going to come back to pricing because I want to come back because on the initial panel this morning there are different views around what kind of pricing you need to make the projects work. So we'll come back to that. I want to go to the liquefaction just for a minute. And I had a client call me out last week in London, and he said, you're not thinking enough about the ambient temperature in British Columbia, the fact you've got cooler temperatures. And by the way, the Gulf Coast projects don't particularly work well when you're dealing with humidity and 90 degrees. Ed, let's go to you on that. How much of an advantage would in your view, and I'm putting you on the spot a little bit because you didn't know this question was coming, so don't worry, you can pass it on if you can pass it right back if you don't want it. But is there, with the U.S. Gulf Coast projects, is that going to be a big deal, the humidity and the heat? And then secondly, when I look at the operating costs on the Canadian projects, you're sort of dealing with 40 cents an M, we generally generalize those. Do the cooler temperatures actually help from either an operating or capital cost perspective, or is that a bit of a red herring? Do you want to think about that one?
I think the heat and humidity is probably a bit of a red herring on the Gulf Coast. I mean, it's always been there. You know what you're dealing with. You know what you're designing for.
Yeah.
So I think that should be at least a manageable and a quantifiable kind of dynamic that you're looking at. It's a matter of engineering, probably one of the more predictable aspects of this project, of these projects, in a way. So I would think thermodynamics works, and whatever that advantage is, it should be. I will defer to others better in their thermo and engineering in terms of exactly what that is. I know we do have those that address that in the IHS circumstance. I do think there's a long history of dealing with this in the business in the Gulf Coast as well. So I wouldn't say it's a red herring. It's just an engineering fact of life that is quantifiable and will be what it is.
Okay, and reflect in just lower utilization rate. A little bit like the oil sands. It gets cold, projects don't run as well, and then it gets warmer, and they tend to do better. Okay, that's helpful.
I mean, we make broad assumptions too. I think that other uncertainties are greater than that range, more than likely. The other uncertainties in terms of just getting the material and the labor in place to actually develop the liquefaction are probably a greater source of uncertainty overall in the project development equation.
Okay, very good. There was, we're going to mix it up here a little bit. There was a question just from the audience. It was, what do you believe are the primary risk management issues impacting the competitiveness of BC LNG? Let me turn the question around a little bit right now, and I wanted to go back to something that Tim touched on, which is, you've got aggregators in the Gulf Coast, you've got a lot of pricing flexibility around Henry Hub. Is there an expectation amongst the panel that over time the U.S. LNG projects will begin to look more like the projects in Australia or Canada from the standpoint of integration, i.e., does the risk, and maybe Tim, it's a good place to start with you, is your sense that the risk inherent in these projects over time, that with U.S. projects you gradually see more upstream, more JVs and so forth to deal with that risk?
Well, yeah, I mean, my view, just to go right to the answer, I don't think we're going to see that based on what we know right now. Again, based on some of the feedback we saw, a negative, like a major strike for the U.S. Gulf Coast from the perspective of national oil companies and strategic entities who were looking for an LNG position was the lack of integration. So they've gravitated to other places, including Canada. For many of those guys, it was a non-starter to look at a U.S. Gulf Coast project without that full integration. So that that was a big point for some people, but they've gone elsewhere, right? There's other issues with the U.S. Gulf Coast that we encountered when we were trying to compare the two. With Canada, some of the opportunities in the U.S. Gulf Coast they're being operated by smaller entities with less of a track record. 3 or 4 years ago, nobody knew whether Cheniere was going to be able to pull off a project. Now they have had some success and they've got momentum. But the next one up is Freeport, which again is got some smaller parties involved there. So that's a feature that some of Petronas's partners looked at and had some second thoughts about. One other comment just about the Gulf Coast, I'm not sticking to the script exactly, is, it's lower calorific gas, it's lower heat content. And so that somewhat restricts your target markets a little bit, and it also has an impact on the economics. So that's different from Montney gas, or at least some Montney gas.
John,
sorry, if I can just jump in there.
Absolutely,
I think that projects will ultimately integrate should offtake parties or buyers force them to. So I think that right now, I think that we're years away from seeing vertical integration in the U.S. market, and it's something that we've kicked around, but we haven't contemplated it in great detail because we don't think, if you look at kind of the 5 front-running projects, that they really have shown a desire to vertically integrate at this stage. Yeah. And what you've seen is it's really buyer-specific. So if the buyer is solely trying to source the lowest cost landed gas on their shores and ultimately doesn't want to make an investment in the decision, well, they tend to shift or gravitate towards the U.S. Gulf Coast market. If the buyer has other considerations, and some of it might even be knowledge of E&P upstream development, they might go for an integrated approach and one day port some of that technological advantage or knowledge back to their own domestic markets longer term. So I think that the buyer ultimately determines whether we see vertical integration stepping in.
If I could just add a little bit to that, nothing prevents vertical integration in the U.S. and the U.S. Gulf Coast. It simply doesn't always make sense in the context of the U.S. market. There are other service providers, when there are 32 billion cubic feet per day of gas moving in and around the Texas and Louisiana markets, it simply doesn't make as much sense in that context. But if you wanted to mechanically fix your gas supply from some well in Texas to your firm pipeline transportation to your LNG export facility, you would be free to do so on the U.S. Gulf Coast as much as anywhere else.
It's a good question that just came in. Where does, not that the other ones weren't, I'll get to those too. They're all very good. Where does the certainty or uncertainty of First Nations play a role in terms of global competitiveness? And I'll open this one. Anybody who wants this one can take it. Because we've talked, we've spent some time talking about competitiveness. I think there's been a big focus on the resource, what liquefaction is going to cost you. We know that we're going to build a lot of pipelines and so forth. There was a related question, which is just the stability, obviously, of the government remaining in power. I mean, you heard the comment this morning. Obviously, the government, was very successful running on the basis of LNG. They're back in. So why don't we start with you on that one? Is it when you, from an Asian perspective, as you look at Canada, and you look particularly at the province of British Columbia, is there a general recognition that, irrespective of which party is in power, that these projects have enough momentum to carry through, or does it give you a concern? And how does the whole First Nations angle stack up?
Recognition, that's one of the important factors and issues to be considered for this kind of magnitude of the project. And the BC is not so clear so far yet about the process on that kind of, the involvement from the First Nations society. And that may be an important factor which affects the progress of the project and the completion of the project, and make it more competitive as a package of the project to get the competitive products out of BC.
So where is the mindset right now? I think there's a general sense that there's been momentum has built. That clearly there have been steps taken. Our sense has been that actually momentum feels like it's slowed down just a little bit over this past year. Where's the Asian mindset? And then let's go to Tim after. right now? Is your sense that there's a reluctance to make commitments in terms of offtakes or to become involved until there's more clarity, or is it something that's going to come out with a wash in due course?
That's a good question. That is one of the factors which may cause a kind of a delay on the process for that kind of important decision, and most of the players are waiting for that kind of clean up in the view there, I think.
Tim, what's your take?
Well, I think it's obviously a very important issue. It's just one of many building blocks. But again, it hasn't stopped at least one so far successful consortium of forming and bringing new parties to the table. As I said in some of my opening comments, I mean, Petronas is new to North America. They were brand new to North America 3.5 years ago. And some of their partners that they have in their project now are comparatively new as well. So they don't have that experience or that knowledge or familiarity, but I mean, it hasn't stopped them from making commitments to at least try and advance this project. It's not something that they're downplaying by any stretch, but it's just one of a whole host of factors, you know, it'll have to. You know, all these issues will have to get addressed over time. I mean, I guess I would say, in Australia, again, I'm generalizing to a great degree here, but Aboriginal rights were perhaps, at least some spots in Australia, less well defined. And so what happened there was many of the companies that went to develop commercially LNG projects, entered into land use arrangements and agreements with many of the natives in that country. To advance their project in conjunction with those stakeholders. In East Africa, I mean, there's social tensions in that country. If you want to talk about people issues I mean, that's a situation. I don't want to do a compare and contrast necessarily here, but in East Africa, they're going to have less issues on the labor front. They have way fewer restrictions in terms of bringing people into that country potentially to help develop those projects. But they have uncertainty in terms of some social tensions, in terms of what their domestic demand for gas is going to be vis-a-vis these projects. They've got capital tax uncertainty. I mean, there's issues in each of these countries, and I know we spent a lot of time today thinking in a very serious fashion about what are some of the things holding Canada back. But again, we should think about it as glass half full, not half empty necessarily. I mean, every country, every area has issues they've got to work through. They're different, of course, but there's no nirvana here in terms of jurisdictions to develop these projects.
John, you spent some time in Australia in terms of looking at projects. What are the lessons that would have come out of Australia from that boom? And then let's go to Ed on the same question.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to tour the Queensland region last year. I'm actually going back in 2 weeks to look at one of the major projects in the Queensland region again as kind of a follow-up trip. And I think the key challenge that was faced in that market is obviously cost inflation, but cost inflation, everybody immediately thinks about it just being accelerating labor demands and everybody wanting more and everybody wanting a bigger piece of the pie. And I think the biggest challenge that you had in that market is multiple stalling factors that led to massive cost inflation. So I think that the biggest challenge that you have is a lack of collaboration in that market from the onset, and where Canada can do it differently is more collaboration in terms of possibly integrating or merging together a couple facilities to not have competition on the same engineering labor pool from the various companies to build competing projects. So from a sequencing perspective, we can do it a little bit better in terms of trying not to have 3 projects reach FID all in concurrent fashion. But the other thing, and I think it's big, that the government has to do is that as much as we have a well-defined regulatory structure for approving these projects and supporting the industry, some of the biggest challenges that you had in Australia wasn't that the cost of drilling the well ended up being 25 or 30 or 50% above what it was originally expected. It was that you waited 2 to 3 days in between wells for permits to actually get approved. So you're actually your delivered cost should have come in relatively in line with what you would have expected, but you were sitting 3 days on a permit, paying a drilling rig and a crew to sit by and not do anything and wait for the next permit to be approved. So if we are actually going to go through a massive boom, the government has to think about making sure that you man the regulatory bodies to deal with that rapid acceleration that's going on in the market. And I think that those are some of the lessons, the easy lessons that we can try to not replicate in the Canadian market is go, what were the actual pinch points? Because often the pinch points weren't just too many projects going at once, it was too little planning going into that rapid acceleration and trying to determine how you're going to deal with that rapid acceleration, because every economy goes through ebbs and flows, and you can deal with it if you think far enough in advance.
Ed?
Well, just briefly, I mean, I'm no expert on First Nations issues, first of all, but I'm struck by some of our clients and contacts that have come to us and talk about what it means to dialogue with a diverse community like that. What, you know, who speaks for that? Whom do you contact with? And one of them simply said to me directly, you don't apparently understand. We are in direct discussions now with 20 separate organizations. You know, just managing that and bringing that to consensus, you know, has to be a challenge. And I'm not saying it's insurmountable by any means, but it certainly is a material challenge. And, you know, I don't know to what extent a single organization can obstruct, but it, you know, has to be a material consideration in projects such as this.
I think with that, we are out of time, so I would like to thank all of our panelists. Thanks, very, very good discussion. And let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.